other distinctions that people have been making since Tolnecker. So the basic idea was from there, but this idea of source of information, the idea of speaker versus addressee commitment, the idea that some syntactic forms carry with them the requirement of commitment and some don't, that they can shift things like answer particles may have sensitivity to who is the source of the information. Remember that difference between ya and o? That was in Gunloksel's paper, right? And of course, one big one that we recognized every time we talked about questions, we didn't study it at any length, again, because your instructor does not know enough about it, which is prosody. Apparently, that's really, that was seen to be crucial even when we did our presentations. So you should have a Gyan session on prosody and invite me to be a student in class. Okay. Is this open to?
Yes.
Yeah, people. So sometime in the future. Okay. Let's see. We talked about bias. All these are interrelated. Shrika, did you want to add something? No. Okay. And how bias arises or may arise, and when we were looking again at the presentations, we noted some facts about where you would or wouldn't get bias. We also saw that sometimes the prosody allows you to get away from bias and sometimes not. And we looked at, scope marking, of course. How could we forget scope marking? And we compared it to extraction. And in the we looked at what the syntactic and semantic ramifications of that might be. But we also tried to make some headway in understanding why one would use one over the other. There seems to be specific discourse conditions that may be at issue there. And again, it had to do with speaker and addressee, how much, not a commitment to the sentence, but to the proposition that would be an answer to the question, but rather some commitment or declaration in the discourse to being interested in the answer of the embedded question. So that was another interesting thing that we were looking at. Does embedding simply enter into the composition as an argument of the embedding predicate and that's it? Or is it possible to think of the discourse contribution of the embedded predicate as somehow more relevant than, or not more relevant, but being the question that the discourse is about? So some kind of a more nuanced view of the role of embedding in terms of the pragmatics, not in terms of the syntax necessarily. Sometimes that too. Okay. And also in connection with the scope marking, we talked of cross-clausal dependencies, that some dependencies are more easily are tractable, some less so. So variable binding seem to be less tractable for languages like German, but not for South Asian languages, right? Even when the prosody suggested that you have two distinct clauses, some people, at least in some languages, some of the groups that looked at this in the South Asian languages felt that you could still do variable binding cross clauses. So that's something that we could think about for the future. Okay. We're not done yet. We also looked at question-answer congruence. We had lots of discussions. What do we do with our intuitions about, is this a good answer to that question? And I don't think we came to any agreement, and I don't think we necessarily should come to agreements all the time, but we came to a better understanding of what the issues might be in deciding whether this is a direct answer. All of the semantics that we presented is predicated on that view. And some things we all agree may not be direct answers, but on some things, I think there's a genuine difference of opinion. And the negative answer is one of them. And then Ankana raised even today a question, what's the status of an answer? Who did you talk to? Well, I talked to some students there. Is that a direct answer? And there are people who have, with good reason, argued that yes, you also need WHs to potentially quantify with generalized quantifiers. So some people, I talk to some students, I talk to most students, I talk to every student, those would be your alternatives. Someone else may say that's not a direct answer. You scan the list of answers that you have, and if it looks like one or two, then you say some, etc., etc. So either you can think of it as an indirect answer or a direct answer. So this is very much something that I think is a matter of your own views, or your own hunches, but also looking at what arguments you might use to support it. You have to think about things like clefts that may not allow the negative answer. You have to think about, is there a difference between cross-speaker dialogues, or the same speaker admitting to lack of knowledge and then saying no one, etc., etc. We looked at types of answers to multiple WH questions very briefly. We talked about some paired list answers that may not be genuine paired list answers. I think we spent maybe half an hour, I don't know, 45 minutes. You could spend a semester on each one of these. We looked at the theory of selection, the responsive rogative divide, which is the basic divide between whether you can take an interrogative, or whether you must take an interrogative, or whether you have a choice. And then we saw that things are not that selection is a somewhat fluid matter when it comes to certain things that we call root phenomena. But they were systematic. There were differences, but interesting differences. And of course we looked at scrambling a lot, right? And whether there was anything particular about the pre-verbal position that seemed to be a favored position for South Asian languages, and whether that meant that was a case of WH movement to a fixed position, or whether there was something else to whether there could be an explanation that simply posited that movement. And again, we saw some issues there where it could either be movement to that position, but it had to be accompanied perhaps by some kind of scrambling. And we didn't really, as yet, come to know of a good theory of scrambling that gets quite that fact. I think we also looked at alternative ways of scope taking that WH movement. So we looked at focus population, we looked at choice function analysis, now we looked at Skolem functions, etc., etc. But Skolem functions are essentially the same as WH, the way I presented it. It fits in with WH movement. It's really playing with the domain of quantification. Whereas focus population or choice function analysis suggests something qualitatively different because choice functional binding typically goes with a null operator or equimorpheme. Whereas this is simply saying, take any rich phrase of the right type, just like you can quantify over propositions or properties, you can quantify over Skolem functions. And of course, then one would say, how would you take these kinds of data and interpret them with choice functions, or interpret them in the focus population system? And nothing says that there has to be only one way in natural language. In fact, I believe there's data to show that you need more than one way for WHs to take scope. And finally, of course, our beloved polar kya basically simply raises the issue of whether a language that has something that coincides or correlates with the present or occurs only in yes-no questions must be a yes-no particle, or sorry, must be the lexical realization of the yes-no operator. And we try to think of other ways in which that might be the case, crucially tying it in with the structure of the left periphery. And the idea that you could have structures that have in the syntax this is the idea that the left periphery actually is where reference to the addressee and the speaker and the addressee and other contextual factors may be located in the syntax. And to the extent that you can embed things, we can raise that question: do we have embedded structures that are bigger than just the standard CP? I should say that it is quite possible that once one has done the compositional semantics, once one has derived the distribution through compositional semantics and building in all of these pragmatic constraints, one should go back and ask, now that we have these tools, do we really need that much structure in the left periphery to capture those facts? We haven't done that. We've presented it using the left periphery, the potential for encoding it in structures above CP. But I think when you're done with the analysis that captures all the facts, it's good to step back and then ask yourself, what is really at the heart of the explanation? How is it that the left periphery allows you a way to express those ideas, or is it crucially tied to that structure at the left periphery? And that is something that, someone could look at, or we might look at. And finally, coordination. You must always leave every paper, every course with questions that are not answered. That's my justification for presenting coordination that I don't know much about in all of 1 hour or half an hour or whatever it was. But I think we enjoyed looking at these things. Maybe I want to end with one quote from Chomsky that I've always liked, and that I think makes me believe that the way in which we do these workshops have value beyond just the data that they collect. So let me see if I can find it quickly. Okay, yes. So this is the quote from Chomsky, 1986, I think, Knowledge of Language. There's a tension between the demands of descriptive and explanatory adequacy. To achieve the latter, explanatory adequacy, it is necessary to restrict available descriptive mechanisms so that few languages are accessible. To achieve descriptive adequacy, however, the available devices must be rich and diverse enough to deal with the phenomena exhibited in the possible human languages. We therefore face conflicting requirements. We might identify the field of generative grammar as an area of research with the domain in which this tension, the tension between descriptive and explanatory adequacy, remains unresolved. I don't know, it just sounds good to me. And it means South Asian languages provide a rich empirical terrain that current theories should grapple with. But then it's on us, South Asian linguists, to talk in terms that are easily accessible to them. And that means making sure that when we present data that we are thinking of a reader who does not know all the details about. I mean, even if I don't know Marathi, I know something about South Asian languages that I can fill in. But you must think about the person who maybe doesn't know anything. I mean, or you have to get them interested, and you have to present your intuitions and your ideas and your explanation in terms that can reach a wider audience. So I think that's a good point to stop, and then you guys can, if you have, anyone wants to make a comment, otherwise.
If there are any questions which they might have wanted to ask you.
Yeah. Yes, Gayatri.
Just one thing, when the Dravidian group was presenting, you have made a comment that since there is already a Q particle, so the word that they have that they call polar is adding bias because it's already there. But if we consider the data you have presented, so even in Hindi, it made a claim that it's an intonation that's giving and the kya is just there. So why doesn't it happen in Hindi?
So I think Gargi is pushing me on this idea that I kind of sneaked in even today, that when do you get bias? When there's an unmarked form and a marked form, something like that, right? And you're saying, well, even Hindi, there's a intonation. So intonation gives you the unmarked form. Why doesn't kya add to that, right? And then become a bias thing. So yeah, that's a good question. Why do I not consider? Okay.
Then again, the intonation can give you bias as well. You can change the intonation and get the bias. You don't have to be kya letters necessarily to get the bias.
In the handout that we had, it said the intonation is basic. Even if you have kya, you need the intonation.
Yeah.
Otherwise,
Yeah,
it's not.
that's there.
Yeah, no, so I think.
Yeah,
So why isn't
it?
Yeah, why isn't the intonation like functioning like a like the way syntactic inversion does, and then when you have so when in the Dravidian languages you have the O, right, in the example. Which language was that? Malayalam. So I said O is like a syntactic marker, and therefore the fact that you guys said that the what adds bias, right?
And also the what is actually a thematic what. I mean, it's
No.
right? It is homophonous to thematic.
Yeah, but there may be it's not playing the role of a.
It's not playing the role of the thematic what, but it's the same what that we.
But that's true also for kya.
For when we were
For us,
okay. So I was thinking about it in terms of what happens.
We did the ki tumi ki ashbe, so there's a homophonous this, so we can't make out. But in Assamese, if you see,
just like in Malayalam,
it's a different. They use the whatever their thematic what is, they use that in the clause initial position, and they have the did what polar what.
And then do they get bias?
Yes.
Okay. So I think Gargi's question, she's challenging me. What is so different about No, I like that. Even if you're not literate. The question is, why isn't intonation playing the same role in Hindi that the O on the verb is playing in Malayalam, or the ki in Assamese, was it? Or any okay. Why isn't, I don't know, it just is. That's how, like I have a notion of what is unmarked, but you're absolutely right. Like I said, this is something that I would like to explore. But any time you say marked, unmarked, you've got to, there has to be some theoretical, empirical bite to it. And that's precisely the kind of question one has to ask. And you're right that even in Hindi, you can introduce bias with intonation. But there's a sense in which just the basic rising contour doesn't do it. So, remains to be seen though. Yeah, but.
So maybe, so initially that's what I thought, that we have to have a notion of what is unmarked, and then, and secondly, so the rising intonation may not be, so to speak, some kind of, so no lexical addition, but some manifestation of syntactic question operator. But so like Gangotson said, contingent commitment, right? So maybe what Hindi and Marathi or other languages are doing is to have an unmarked intonation pattern, and that just marks the contingent commitment.
And nothing more.
Nothing more. And the modification into it is sort of disambiguates in different contexts, whether you're getting bias or something else.
So then, if one went back to Gundoksan, we either say the rise is what is. So what makes that marked? Declarative plus. So this marked unmarked thing. This is how one would have to argue so that it doesn't. To be an explanation, it's got to be, you have to have some everything, you can't have just moving parts, right? Because then you don't have an explanation, because the next challenge that comes, you say, well, but then something else. So determining what are the parts that you are starting off with as fixed, that, I don't know, why did I bring that up? It's just a thought feeling I have. But no,
But in fact, intonation is also if you have a bias, it's not at the place where the question is. So if you want a bias, you have to place from kya and not
I don't know.
Yeah, so that's what I meant, that we have to have an idea of what is unsparked,
I'm
right?
not sure what.
I'm not sure.
Prosody is something we can't guess over just right.
So I think there is a theory of how syntax maps to syntax and the interface between syntax, semantics, and prosody. And I guess this is really saying that there's and there's work out there. It's not that it's not out there. If you read Buring's international meaning, that's one could look at that and use that as a starting point. Any other thoughts or questions or?
Yeah, one very general question. GP stresses on the idea of autonomy of syntax, right? So in interface studies, does that challenge that concept, or my understanding of autonomy as independent functional syntax itself is wrong?
Should I answer yes? Is that it? No, so, there's a whole history to this idea of autonomous syntax. Certainly, GB syntax, that's what I kind of grew up with. This is known as the T model or the sometimes the Y model. It was D structure, S structure, LF, and PF. So these were the interface areas. There's a sense in which you can say there's certain things that happen in the syntax without regard to how they could be interpreted. And then there, at least one way of looking at case and agreement could be that, right? You need to move to subject position in order to satisfy EPP or whatever is the current way of doing. Why we have to have an expletive in English for it rains, right? That the subject position has to be filled with something. That probably has nothing to do with LF. So the question becomes interesting when you talk about WH movement, quantifier raising, etc. Is it the case that we have a quantifier and we raise it regardless because it has a feature that says I'm a quantifier? Like there's got to be some semantics in there, right? Something that says I'm a quantifier. So that's one way of thinking about it. The other way is to say all DPs can move. Some DPs when they move will make a difference to meaning and some won't. So it's not that the proper name Mary can't quantify raise. It raises. It doesn't make much difference because of the type of thing it is. In the end, it will be scope. It will have the scope effects will be neutralized. But there are also views that say you only move if it will, like Fox's economy condition on QR. You don't move unless you have a reason to, unless it will make a semantic difference. And that kind of cuts into the idea of autonomous syntax, it seems to me. But the view that, you do whatever LF syntactically allow, any rearrangement of scopal elements such that you have a transparent syntactic structure. And then the semantics comes in and does whatever it needs to do. That keeps the two more separate. I think that's the way in which I would take it.
Following up, I have a short question. So you said Fox's economy principle where you only move it makes a difference to meaning, right? Now we can think of it in two ways. If that things happen and it's filtered out if there is no meaning, or if there is no change, if there is a change in meaning only then
it will move.
So
Yeah.
which one? I don't see how we can judge it, at least using this.
Not based on what we've talked about here, but he has arguments with very compelling arguments based on VP ellipses, across the board. It's not across the board extraction, something else. Anyway, so he had arguments to say you don't move unless you have to. From strict sloppy identity, those kinds of examples. So, but that was an argument he made. And was interesting and I think quite compelling and worth thinking about. I don't think anybody really talks about the autonomy of syntax in the same way anymore. I think I could be wrong. Should I hand it over to you now? You wanted half an hour for something? Or both of you?
It's a wrap-up session. There's a wrap-up session.
So yeah, this is further wrapping up. I've wrapped up my piece.
So this is a wrapping up after the wrapping up session. So basically, so we have done this 10 days. We have been on the exploration of questions and answers. So this is what is going to follow after that. This is something that we wanted to talk to you about.